So why is Satya Nadella a better example of agile leadership than Steve Jobs? That's a great question. So it's going to be very contentious because of the number of people that really like Steve. And Steve was great. Steve Jobs was fantastic for Apple. But I think the difficulty that you see the difficulty that he created at Apple, and you see it today. And that's that when Steve was running Apple, everything was awesome. They were innovative, creating new ideas, but they weren't really. He was. He was driving that innovation and those changes with almost like an iron fist. And the way he treated people was very, very, very bad from the measure of today, right? Kind of toxic working environment. But he was at Apple. It was successful. He left Apple, or he got ousted by the board, I think. It was then not successful. They brought him back. It was successful. He died, and then Apple started to lose their innovation edge. So there was no sustained, inbuilt innovation systemically across the organization. It was all in that pyramid structure of command and control. Whereas when Satya Nadella took over Microsoft, he started, and it takes time in organizations of that scale and that history, he started making changes to the organization to effectively, again, I know everybody says this, right, but push responsibility down the organization so that the people doing the work have more say in how the work is done. And you can see that across lots of different parts of the business. I mean, the Windows team and the Azure DevOps team are teams that I've worked with a little bit with the Teams team, and they're a lot more innovative. It's innovation across the board, so everybody in all of the teams is responsible for coming up with ideas and trying to implement them and figuring out what the smallest thing they can change is. But the real push comes from the non-logical systemic changes that are starting to happen across the business. So for example, they used to measure the Azure sales folks. They would get bonused based on the number of hours of Azure that they sold. And what they found was they would have unhappy customers, because customers would buy 1 million hours of Azure for the year because the salesperson was great and managed to sell them on it and all the cool things they would use it for and the ideas and all of those things. And then at the end of the year, they would get their bill for the 1 million hours of Azure and realize that they'd only used 50,000 of those 1 million hours, but they still have to pay for them. So that's a focus on, as a business, on revenue extraction versus value creation. The customer didn't get value from that transaction, or a small amount of value compared to what they paid. Whereas a small change in the way you measure the sales folks, and what they did was they changed the sales folks' bonuses from sales to usage. So the sales folks now get their bonus based on the amount of Azure hours that their customers use, which means the salesperson is now not the person who's got the biggest gift of the patter to clinch the sale and get the deal. They're the person who can long-term engage with the customer and help them get better at using the thing you're trying to sell so that they get more value from it. So they would do things like, I've done engagements where somebody in Microsoft sales has hired me to come in and talk to the customer about getting better at DevOps and the benefits they would get from it in order to increase the level of DevOps and adaption and change in the customer, because that salesperson knew that company's operations team couldn't keep up with the need for change. Therefore, they would then have to utilize services in Azure. Therefore, they would get more bonus, right? So you're turning the negative behavior measure into a positive behavior measure, right? The salesperson gets their bonus, but the customer also gets the value. And you're starting to see that change in other parts of the business as well, as they go through and figure out, what does this actually mean to us? What does this change in outlook, change in attitude? And part of this comes from Satya is an incredibly pragmatic guy. He's an engineer in background, so he's built products. He understands the difficulty of being building products and having those things imposed, and he understands the power of the people that are in his organization, that they're the ones that are important to the business, they're the ones that are driving it. And it's not just a Satya versus Steve Jobs idea. You can see it in the way Richard Branson approaches his companies. He talks about his job is not to look after customers. His job is to look after his employees. Their job's to look after the customers. He doesn't have to worry about that, because if they're happy, they'll do that job and do it well. And there's a huge switch at the moment from, I feel like, from in leadership styles, from this idea of stuff-focused leadership to people-focused leadership, right? Instead of focusing on more stuff, more money for the shareholders, more money for them, more output of product, they're starting to focus on how do we enable the people in our organization to maximize the value that we deliver so that our customers trust us over the long term. And Simon Sinek talks about this a lot. He talks about moving from the finite game to the infinite game. If you're playing a finite game, you there's a moment where we all stop, count up score, and find out who wins, right? That's a finite game. All of my board games are finite games. They have a set of rules. We all play by the same rules. A point in time where we stop and find out who wins. But the infinite game is how businesses run. Businesses run on the infinite game. There's no point in time where we all stop. The whole world doesn't stop. We count up score and see who's won in that world. It will continue on infinitely. So that's that focus on people, that focus on leadership, that focus on the long-term vision of the company and the products. Is that long-term infinite focus, and that for me is the big difference between Steve Jobs and Satya Nadella, and it's actually the same difference between Steve Ballmer, previous CEO at Microsoft, and Satya as well.